In any event, we're very grateful, Neill, to have you with us today. Neill De Paoli comes from, where are you from, Neill? Kittery, Maine.
Yeah, now, yes.
Where he lives with his wife. But Neill has been coming to the whole area here, certainly colonial Pemaquid, for nearly 50 years. He first came to work with Helen Camp and Bob Bradley and the archaeologists who were digging up the entire area of Fort William Henry, Fort Charles, Fort Frederick, and Neill was one of the individuals who was with them at that particular time. When Neill went to Brown University, went on to the University of New Hampshire to take a PhD there. Neill has done all different kinds of work. He's been an adjunct professor at the University of Southern Maine Community College. He's also worked for the OBHS. That's not Old Bristol Historical Society, but the Old Berwyn Historical Society in Southern Maine, where he's done an awful lot of archaeological digs and research and writings there. Neill also, of course, put together in our Pemaquid Museum that very wonderful exhibit entitled Guns, Politics, and Furs, The History of Pemaquid and the Conflict Among the French, Native Americans, and the English. For 5 years, Neill, of course, has been the manager of colonial Pemaquid, and I think that Neill is probably the singular person who knows more about what's under the ground in all of Bristol, and certainly in all of Pemaquid, than any person I know. Anyway, let's give a warm welcome to Neill De Paoli.
Thanks, Bobby. Good evening, everybody. This presentation I'm going to give tonight is kind of interesting for me in that as a little kid of 2, started summering in Maine, but not on the coast. Belgrade Lakes. Grandparents had a place, a great pond, since the late 30s, and so beginning in 1952, I came up there every summer, and when I was younger, it was for a month. And back in the good old days, when you go to camp, you stayed there. And there was no TV. We had a party line for a while, and it was a different time, and I still would love it if that way. And unfortunately, we sold the place, but in 2003. Anyway, where I'm going with this is that Great Pond was part of a series of about 6 or 7 lakes and ponds that were obviously part of the Belgrade Lakes region, and had an extensive prehistoric Native American presence there. And I, not surprisingly, learned how to swim as a little kid, learned how to canoe, and things that you would associate with the world that we're going to be looking at tonight. And so it was, in a way, I'm looking back and I say, boy, I wish my head was where it would have, or is now, back when I was in that area, because there have been a lot more things that I would have gotten into, particularly looking at, for example, where Native Americans set up their encampments, where they canoed, where they portaged, and the whole bit. I did have an opportunity as a 14, 15-year-old on camp up in Lake George. The 4th year I was there, we went on a long canoe trip, about 8 days, and on that canoe trip, we had to portage, carry our canoes a lot, anywhere from 200 yards to about 1.25 miles. And so I remember what my shoulders felt like after carrying a 95 to 110 pound aluminum canoe, sometimes alone, other times with a partner. Imagine what it would have been like as a Native American, or as John Giles, who is a Pemaquid boy, who did canoe, not surprisingly, after in the course of his activity. So there is a connection, personal connection for me. I'd also like to point out I brought in 4 books here. One is really beaten up. It'll give you some idea as to how important it's been to me. Acadia at the end of the 17th century. It's a series of letters and journal excerpts, etc., written by Joseph de Villebon, who was essentially the governor of Acadia from around 1690 to 96 798. And anyway, Pemaquid shows up in here, but it gives you a lot of insights as to the Wabanaki, in this case, Pemaquid, and Penobscot, who were part of the story that I'll be talking about. So I'll give it to folks. You want to pass around, just be careful with it. Another one, Above the Gravel Bar by David Cook. He wrote this in 1985, and essentially this is an amazing piece of work in that it covers his travels as a canoeist and as a historian throughout Maine, and he basically reconstructs the Native American canoe routes from Pemaquid area or mid-coast all the way up in the North Woods, and gave me a lot of insight into why the birchbark canoe was so important for Native Americans for a whole variety of different reasons I'll get into tonight. So feel free, again, to take a look. If not, write down the title if you're interested. Canoe Indians of Down East Maine. This was written by William Haviland, and he is still alive. He's in his late 80s or around 90. Lives in Deer Isle, and he essentially gives you a cook's tour of Maine's Native Americans from Paleo times, Paleo-Indian times, so about 12,000 years ago, up to present day. And it's very readable, lots of good illustrations, etc. And then last but not least, the American Indian as a sea fighter in colonial times. And this author, Horace Beck, this is written in the 1959, but he dove into any references to the Native American in New England and their maritime expertise and how they utilize it in dealing with these newcomers, these people are making incursions in their territory, the English. So, pass that around. All right, so tonight we're going to take a look at essentially the interaction between and the role that Native American and English watercraft played between these two groups. How did they utilize them? How were they made? What made them important? And then the cultural exchange that did occur that had a major role in maybe changing the course for both of these groups, the English and Native Americans. And we'll get into some social elements, canoe routes, and the whole 9 yards. So, yes?
Back up maybe, and then you would take your mask off so people could feel a little...
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay, is that all right, folks? I can be noisy, but there you go.
You can even take it off.
Yeah, it's okay, just in case I get too close again. So the earliest evidence of the indigenous canoe dates back to about 700 years. Some of you might be aware of the fact that in 2017, archaeologists discovered a wooden dugout canoe in Cape Porpoise, a harbor at Kennebunkport. And I'm presuming it's still being conserved, but it was, I think, about 20 feet long, and they did a dendrochronological examination of it and dated about 700 years ago. And this is the earliest archaeological example. That does not mean it's the earliest dugout canoe. We just haven't found anything earlier dating that. Some scholars posit the thought that some kind of watercraft that was being utilized by Native Americans could go back as about 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 years ago. And they base that in the fact that on a number of archaeological sites in Maine, they have found evidence of our Wabanaki ancestors fishing for large cod, 100, 110 pounds, and then swordfish, if you can imagine that. So they didn't swim out there and try and troll there. They were getting out there offshore to do that. So there's a long story as far as watercraft. Dugout canoes, again, don't really know. The birchbark canoe, there's some debate over that. Some speculate that it may have appeared about the time of initial contact with the Europeans, English or French initially, and then English in the mid-1500s, maybe a little bit more recently than that. Others push it back to around 1,500, 2,000 years. So this is still open to debate. Birchbark trees have been around for a long period of time, well prior to that. And as some of you might know, they're utilized not only for the birchbark canoe, containers, decorative items, the whole gamut, and even birch bark as far as a shelter. And a number of English and French accounts, and I'd love to read some of them, but for example, Nicholas Denis, going back to 1672, is a page long, and I think that might put some people to sleep. But essentially, they give us a lot of insight into the whole process of making a birch bark canoe. How do you get it? There are practitioners that are out there today. A guy who I know somewhat, Steve Kayard, has been active for about 30, 35 years. He is Anglo, not Wabanaki, but he is so good that he's worked very closely. They trust him. Penobscot, Passamaquoddies over the last at least 20 years, where he has been running programs where involving the general public, involving the Penobscot tribal group, to have him guide them through the whole process and teaching them this lost art form. It's not totally lost, but it had been lost by a lot of folks as part of just changes over time, along with language. And a lot of you are probably aware of the fact that there's been a real fluorescence within the Wabanaki community as part of a national phenomena, but a bit later here, of these folks discovering, rediscovering their roots and who they are, their past, present, where they want to go with that, and being much more proactive socially, culturally, and politically, which is great. So anyway, so these various observers provide some real insight into the canoe. This is one of the more interesting image that came off of a petroglyph, and just quick, petroglyph as opposed to a pictograph is a pecked, something that's been pecked into stone. Glacial erratics, ledge on the shoreline typically, not always, the seacoast and freshwater areas. And the two most well-known areas are Machias Port and Ebden, where they found a whole series of about 150 various images, symbolic, spiritual, etc. Any one of them, and unfortunately when I found this, it was on one of those books that's floating around. There wasn't a source, so I don't know how old this image is, but my guess is, I speculate here, somewhere between 5 and 2,000 years BP, based on the research that they've done. The petroglyphs go back around 3,000 years up to early historic times, up until the early 1700s in Maine, but they're seen all over North America. And so, lo and behold, we see these two canoes, birch bark, dug out, hard to say, but with the prows on, my guess is they were birch bark, and with the canoeists in them. So a neat sort of look at that to complement what the European observers with their own biases said about the birch bark canoe.
What was the third petrograph there?
That is, unfortunately, it's just because I cut it off to get this full image here, is of a moose. So you're looking at the forelegs and the snout of a big moose. And hunting a moose is something that's fairly recent, with maybe the last 1,000, 2,000 years. That's just a ballpark figure. But anyway, thanks for bringing that up, Bobby. And this is what the Wabanaki were following as far as their seasonal subsistence rounds. And what this is showing you, let's see, let me get this right here, is that March, April, May, so basically the months that you'd be looking at when they're fishing for freshwater eels, the biggest time would have been October. Smelt shad, so anadromous fish that you would have seen in, locally, Pemaquid Falls. Alewives still today, but in much reduced numbers, but back 400 or 500 years ago, they would have been, shad, salmon, smelt, alewives, etc. So not surprisingly, that particular site is archaeologically loaded with both Native American and English artifacts. So this just gives you a quick little overview of how this dictated their lives and the big role that the birch bark canoe would have played in getting around from the coast to the interior of Maine. And this is a great diorama. I haven't actually seen it in real life, but essentially it gives you a good sense as to what you would have seen throughout Maine, and particularly in summertime, summer camp. You're looking basically at maybe an extended family here. You do have much larger encampments in the summer months as the weather gets better and you can support a larger population. But this is a small group here. This would have been on Mount Desert, and lo and behold, there is one of our birchbark canoes. Okay, and you can also get a sense too as the various roles that each of the family members, from the children on up to the adults, male and female, had as to their daily routine. And this is a great representation of an early 19th century Penobscot birchbark canoe. If you were to see a Passamaquoddy, the bow and stern are not as pointed as you would see. I just cut that out just to give you a general sense as to how they would have appeared. And quite an undertaking and a skill that was limited to certain individuals. First thing you have to do is get the birch bark. Now, how do you do that? Steve still does it today. Goes out, he knows areas. I remember asking him this year earlier if I could come out with him on one of his excursions. He said, no, because he wants to keep that to it. Not that he doesn't necessarily trust me, but I could spill the beans inadvertently. And that was pretty much, you stake out just like a fisherman or fisher person. I'm not going to tell you where good grounds for bass, perch, or a lobsterman, because they're going to home in on what I have had for who knows how many decades or so. Anyway, canoes themselves varied quite a bit in size, as you see here, from, the smaller 11 to 14 foot traveled not in the woods, but in the wooded areas adjacent to the stream that you're canoeing along. 12 to 18 feet for river travel, and then 18 to 25 for travel in coastal waters, which is the real tricky part. Remember, these canoes do not have a keel. I've never, and I want to at some point, but I'm getting older, so who knows. It's a tricky bit. Plus, the canoe that we had was an old one, back to probably the 20s or 30s, had a keel and it had seats. These canoes do not have, they have their 4 or 5 thwarts, but you've got to kneel down. And I have a bad back, so who knows. But anyway, and then these larger guys not only would have been carrying people, but cargoes. So let's say you have 3 people in that canoe, or one of your larger canoes, 150, so there's 450 pounds right there, 150 apiece. And then you have, if you're a trapper, of which we are seeing this once we get, particularly when we get into the presence of the French and English, you are now trapping beaver, or not now, you've been trapping beaver, but now it has a commercial price. So that jacks up the whole business, and it kind of throws things out of whack over time for the Native Americans. And I'm not going to get into that in great detail, but anyway, so you may have coming back with, let's say, 2 packs of beaver, and then maybe another 20 hides of moose, which were the big money makers historically. And you're going to carry that stuff. You're canoeing along on the river, the Pemaquid River, the Kennebec, et cetera, but suddenly you come on to some rapids. And again, Pemaquid Falls, great example. What do? Say, we got falls, forget it, I'm done. No, you walk around those falls. In that case, it's relatively easy, and you can continue upriver, which it gets a bit shallower and narrower, to Boyd Pond, for example. You continue above there, in that case, you can ultimately link up with the Damariscotta. You have to take another portage to the west, and then canoe down the Damariscotta River. And you're avoiding, we'll get in that a little bit, the dangers of canoeing around Pemaquid Point. and the coast itself. Very treacherous, weather can change quickly, the winds pick up and bingo bango, like our two buddies at Fort William Henry in 1695 were caught in a early spring storm. Canoe overturns, they're both dead. So, and ultimately something that people probably don't think about is the canoe not only was light, durable, and relatively quick, unless you're having to pull upstream, they provide you with shelter. You're caught in a storm, unexpected storm. Roll that baby over, and you and your two partners can sleep underneath it. It's not ideal, but it's a heck of a lot better than getting soaked. So a lot of advantages it had, and they're relatively easy to repair and relatively durable. And not surprising, over time, the English start using these same canoes that the Native Americans have been using. But the Native Americans are a lot more adept in general as they are in hunting compared with the English, et cetera, et cetera. So. And this, excuse me, gives you a little idea, something that you might not have thought about is a little addition. A sail. Now this could have been canvas, it could have been moose skin, more likely initially on, probably was. So you're getting a little help from Mother Nature to speed things up a little bit. But it also gives you, even though this is an early 19th century image here, or late 18th century, of what, in this case, they're living in. This is up in the Penobscot River or further down east. This would have been covered often with birch bark, big pieces of birch bark that, again, someone would have had to cut up off that birch bark tree that you're going to harvest for that purpose. But anyway, and then you see, of course, in this case, a firearm. So not something you would have seen amongst the Wabanaki prior to, let's say, 1610s, 1620s, and even so it was still limited. And that was thanks in part to the French trading with them. But so, as I think I touched on very briefly before, so you've got these canoes that have a lot of advantages, and one that's particularly important is that they're pretty light. You know, it tops even the larger ones, 85 pounds, as opposed to those Grumman canoes that we were hauling that weighed, as I said, between 95 and 110, and dig right in. Not only does it give you a sense as far as what you could do, but let's back up here. How you would carry it. And this is just one guy with his paddle in hand, and they're unfortunately just clipped off a second partner who's got his own canoe and carrying, oh, actually, no, he's not. He's carrying his gear, their gear, because you have to think about what you're bringing along, your food, and then if you're a trapper, the hides and skins that you have processed and working your way back down to your encampment or to Pemaquid, where you're going to trade, or up to Fort Penagoet and the Penobscot River, trade with the English or the French for, at this stage of the game, goods that will in return will get you 5 pounds of lead shot, 10 pounds of gunpowder, some blankets, dried prunes, broadcloth blanket that you convert into clothing, et cetera, et cetera. And the portages themselves, as I said, varied in length, but they enable you to continue on this network of rivers and streams that course throughout the coast of Maine and into the interior up into the North Woods. And it so happens that the mid-coast was particularly well endowed with a network of these streams and rivers, and they weren't hard to paddle compared to if you're to go further down east. And you had a lot of portage points. They weren't loaded with falls, but there were a few, and you could work your way around those. This gives you a general picture. Pass this around if folks want to take this. I deleted inadvertently the slide that shows you a blow-up of just basically between the Damariscotta and the Pemaquid River of some options you would have had. And this is a little hard to read, but this is essentially where we are. And the one that most people might know about is the one that runs from Back Cove and New Harbor to the mouth of the Pemaquid River. Can everybody see that? Okay. That has an interesting story. How far back in time that goes, you're probably talking about 2,000 years, but you can still take that route. Anybody ever taken it, realizing it in Pemaquid?
You mean through the towns where the bridges, the drawbridge is not?
No. We're talking about Pemaquid Peninsula, okay? Pemaquid Peninsula. So right here, not over on South Bristol. Not the gut. But that was a shortcut route for you to avoid, again, the coast. Anyway, so what I'm talking about is what would be Route 32. So we're going to go Bass-Ack. Well, actually, we're not Bass-Ackwards, but come on, let's back up here. So here we are. So you would hop on Route 32, and if you drive that heading north, you notice that it hugs the river as you head to Round Pond. So that was, I'm ready to bet the bank on that one. That is a vestige of an old Native American route that would take you down to New Harbor. You'd cut through there to avoid going around Pemaquid Point and walk a good 2.5 miles to get to the mouth of the river. Fine and dandy. It's one little problem with the English showing up, particularly when they built the first of 3 forts right at where the portage ends. That wasn't a mistake. They did that for 2 reasons, and I'm holding 3 fingers up. I can't count very well. One, it was a point where they could capture trade with the Native Americans. 2, it basically regulates who's going through there. They now have a look-see on who's coming across or who's going upriver, downriver. And it's a point, an irritant enough for the Native Americans. They complained to Villebon in the 1690s that this basically makes it very difficult for them to hunt for deer and essentially just to portage across, because now you have these new pesky newcomers situated right there with their fort. Fort Charles and Fort William Henry, when it was particularly significant at that point, because they're still, Wabanaki politically and militarily are still pretty powerful. You can see other points of egress. These are old port. This is the one I'm well familiar with. So Route 32, and if you take 32 up to where it intersects with 130, and you follow the road called Indian Trail. Some of you, I know Jody knows that, but others might know. That runs basically at an angle or a diagonal, and it intersects with Snowball Hill. I lived on Snowshoe Circle, so I always mix it. Snowball Hill Road. And if I will show it to you later on, but basically there's a photograph that I found thanks to OBHS that has a picture of the Indian Trail but they say at Pemaquid Point. I don't think that's where it is. I think it's basically the Indian Trail that comes out now, because it intersects, and you can walk, that was an Indian, and that was probably the road that they used to come down. Where it went from there, I don't know, to get back into in this case, the Pemaquid River, and it was the same road that might have been used when the Wabanaki attacked Pemaquid in 1689 without the French. When the second attack, 1676, the first one where they destroyed the village. But they in both cases probably used that. They dumped their canoes over in New Harbor Back Cove and then stealthily worked their way through the woods. And I don't mean that in a negative way. From the English standpoint, it was. But and because they knew this territory as well, if not better than the English did. They've been living here for, upwards of 7,000 years. And so this is giving them access to, not just in Pemaquid here, the falls, but throughout here. wild game, deer, moose, fish, as we mentioned earlier. And then, of course, all these other rivers. There are some other old portages that would take you well beyond the falls right in here, up into northern part of Pemaquid Peninsula. And then ultimately, as I said earlier, there's another portage point. And this should be, I think, Boyd, someone can correct me on this, Boyd's Pond. And that would, actually, no, I think I'm wrong on that. Eastern branch, I'm not sure. That would take you to Damariscotta Lake. So more waters to fish in, freshwater fish, and then back down the Damariscotta River. And then another portage point that would take you over to the Sheepscot, and on and on and on. And of course, we have archaeological examples all over the place. Sheepscot, the Damariscotta, what was the most well-known, or is still?
Oyster.
Whaleback, the shell heaps, massive. You know, so obviously, but look where they are in relationship to these portage points. You connect the dots and it all starts making sense. This gives you a quick look at what would be, and I was looking for good photos that I had taken, I just couldn't find them, but at least it shows you where the Great Falls were and run down. There's 3 sets of falls. Run down to right here, and of course where the mill is. And this is basically the biggest falls. There's a drop there of about, at its highest point, maybe about 6 feet. And here's what we found when a few people I know, this guy behind the camera here, Chuck Rand, dug there in 2011. And anyway, so a pretty extensive presence indicating that they're back as far, possibly around 5,000 years, and up to possibly the early 1600s or a little bit later, because Jean Rodner, who I've known for quite a while, told me she remembered her, I think it was her aunt, telling her that as a girl or a young woman found these blue turquoise glass beads. And I'm going, oh, are they? No, they're not. I don't know where they are. But, so quite a range in time. Trade beads that they were acquired through either the English, probably in that case, or possibly the French. And projectile points, so hunting, a scraping tool here, and just debitage, or just the leftover stuff after making various tools, and maybe a celt, or an axe, or arrowheads, etc. And this is kind of interesting because fast forward to basically 2021, the spring of, when I had a chance to meet several of the Passamaquoddy elvers who were netting elvers. And they've been doing this at least, I think, about the last 10 years. Bobby knows about this. It's been part of, I think, negotiations with getting this set up, Chris Hall, et cetera, et cetera. And it was pretty cool. In that you think, here you look at something that's going back millennia, and they're back at traditional land that they were utilizing and still are for much the same purposes. It has a commercial, except it's a commercial gain here, but nonetheless, the tradition with the nets and the whole arrangement. Their nets extended from here at the mouth, well, you're getting to the mouth of the river, the lower falls here, up a good, so, and it twists and turns probably 300 yards, 350 yards, and then beyond the bridge. But they weren't beyond the bridge, so. So I just sort of gave you a little background as far as the precursors, where they were, the Native Americans, and a little bit of the early historic times. So lo and behold, by the 16 teens, new guys in the block show up, the English. They start out initially on Monhegan, Damariscove. Seasonally, they come for something that the indigenous folks are very much interested in, part of their world, their food source, cod, along with haddock, but cod was the big money maker. And they do this routine for about 10 years, up to the well, it continues, but it changes by the late 1620s. It's seasonal. They come over in late March, and then they fish until late September. And what they catch, which is huge compared to Native Americans because this is an industrial strength kind of operation. They sell in England and Iberian countries, Spain, Portugal, and France. And that continues. By 1626, you have now an operation that's offshore has gone to the mainland. And it's a year-round operation, permanent settlement. It encompasses basically these islands, Fisherman's Island, Damascove, Monhegan. John Smith hangs out there in 1614, sort of sets the table, all the way up to present day Newcastle and Damariscotta. And then between the Muscongas and Damariscotta rivers. Huge chunk of land, population-wise, at its peak in the 1680s, probably no more than about 300 people. There's only a little problem with that, is that they are now occupying land that technically isn't theirs. I mean, argue that with the English crown, but nonetheless. And not only occupying this land, and they're spread out, but you have essentially 7 villages. The main one is at Pemaquid Beach, where the museum is. The main fishing village is at New Harbor. Picking up territory that's very important to the Native Americans for all the reasons that we talked about. Spiritual, sustenance, political autonomy, etc. And now you have this going on. Anyway, relations are relatively benign until the 1670s, but that happens. They set up shop here, as I said, in various locations, Round Pond by the 50s. Even some folks living on what then was called Somerset Island or Louds Island. And then Long Cove, a smattering of fishermen there, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said, the fishing industry. So this is taking a lot more space. It's a bit more intrusive. And this is what you would have seen if you were on the shore of the main village at Pemaquid or at New Harbor. A series of these stages, which are basically either stone-based or wooden superstructure. And then this is where the fish were unloaded from their shallops, or chalupa as the Portuguese called them, the French called them. And then they are then processed. They're gutted, headed, and split, opened up like a book, and salted, and then dried, et cetera, and then shipped over. The cod will last 2 to 3 years with this process, very nutritious. So, and if you're Catholic at the time, great source of sustenance on your Fridays, okay? And then fishing flakes, as how many people here have been to colonial Pemaquid since we have the fishermen's dwelling there over the last 5-6 years? You can see all that in one spot. It's not accurate as far as they have the stages, the flakes up there next to the dwelling. That's for the convenience of people visiting that. In reality, they've been right on the shore there. And I remember talking with Jake Varley, who had a place on Fish Point back in the late 1980s, and he could remember fishermen that were still drying their nets on Fish Point in the 1930s. And I'm sure there's other stuff that's going on, harkening back to another lifestyle, even from the Anglo standpoint. This is their workhorse, the shallop. And this could have either come in a version like this guy here that was open to the weather and elements. It was not decked. So you got in there, and you had a crew of 3 or 4 typically. They could range anywhere from 15 to about 30 feet or so. The larger ones, as I said, were decked and a bit more space down below where you're going to be fishing out of offshore as far out as, let's say, Monhegan, Damascove. But in anywhere as far as weight goes to maybe a half a ton to 10 tons, something like that. It so happens, and so these are the main workhorses for the fishermen. Then we get into the heavy hitters, like the merchantmen. They're sailing over from England, and particularly in the times of the ownership of Robert Aldworth and Giles Eldridge, the 2 original proprietors. They own upwards of 10, Robert Aldworth in particular, the senior partner, owns upwards of 10 ships. anywhere from 120-ton White Angel, and she's sailing. I've come up with evidence of her sailing as early as 1628. At one point, she's bought in 1628 or 29 by Plymouth Plantation and then sold back. So there's interesting commercial links with that. But anyway, to the Angel Gabriel of 1635 fame, she was a big ship, 240 tons. She was regularly sailing over along with these other two guys from Bristol to bring supplies, passengers, not only to Pemaquid, but possibly in some cases up in Newfoundland, and then further down the North Shore where a number of the families that will visit Pemaquid now stop by, the Hayneses, the Blaisdells, and I'm blanking out on 2 or 3 of the others. But so that's an interesting story. These are the ones that are going across the ocean. Shallop could, but very likely would not have. So they're more local coasting vessels. These are playing the role of really bringing goods overseas back to England and to the Maritimes, to Iberian countries, the things that we're talking about, not only fish, but timber for barrel staves and later on for shipbuilding by the 1690s, okay? And they come back loaded up with not only passengers, but the barrels now are filled with Iberian wine, nails, shoes, flour, and on and on and on. Now, interestingly enough, Native Americans very early on, because of their maritime expertise, are good sailors, despite what you've probably been taught or just plain not told, that very adaptable too, in many different ways. I could go through many other things, but by 1602, there was a sighting of a Biscayan shallop with a moose on its sail, painted on the sail. Who was manning it? They weren't French or Spanish Biscay folks, they were Wabanaki. How could they do that? They're savages. Sorry. And this, I'm not saying that suddenly now that's all they're sailing, but they were quite capable. This plays out later on when war breaks out in the late 1670s, 1680s. On a number of occasions, they've captured fishing boats, English coming out of Marblehead, Salem, up in the waters of Nova Scotia. They canoe up, they're armed, they overrun the crews and capture them and use them as negotiating baits, and in some cases they keep them. So again, very adaptive at that art. So something that impresses, and I'm sure to a certain degree surprises the English. And that 1602 sighting wasn't the only one. George Weymouth, I think, had sighted one, a similar situation where they've made adjustments. And even John Jocelyn, in his 2 voyages to New England, in his second voyage, he makes reference, and it's hard to say because he was a bit of a BSer in some of the stuff that he said. His descriptions of how canoes were made was pretty accurate, but he makes reference to seeing a birchen pinnace manned in Boston Harbor by probably a Wabanaki crew with a top-gallant sail and the whole bit. Now, I'm not saying that didn't happen, but there's some, so that I can't say for 100% assurance that actually was seen, but it begs the question and wouldn't have surprised me. This is a ketch, square-rigged, as opposed to the shallop that you saw, a bit larger. These could have been anywhere from 30 to maybe 60 tons. And they are later on in the 17th century used again by the Massachusetts and Maine fishermen. This is just a model, but it gives you some idea. And again, these would have been workhorses as far as the fishing industry. Trading, coasting up and down from, let's say, North Shore with goods, or sailing up to pick up 20 head of cattle at Pemaquid in 1640 from Salem. Sails back down with who knows what was exchanged, But again, an example of their role as far as what they're carrying. Now, what we don't know about commonly, but these ships typically, Jody here's got her husband's off down in Jamaica, okay? A little bit, we'll do better than that, Barbados, 1650s. And she's written a letter to him, and she catches the most recent vessel that's going to sail south, and you got a sister that lives down in Manhattan. So these ships quite often would let people know when they're coming and leaving. And you could drop off, and they put it in a pouch, and that your mail would be delivered, along with, if you're lucky, a copy of the London Gazette, or a newspaper that give you news, albeit 6 weeks old, but in that day and age, it's not necessarily. So again, this gets into a whole nother thing that I'd love to talk about till the cows come home, is you actually have a world that is way more oral than we are. So not only are you, in this case, writing a letter if you're literate, but you can talk to a fisherman that's been off to Monhegan. He stops in at Pemaquid, and he's going down to Boston. And so he goes down to Boston, and he comes back and stops at Pemaquid initially and on to Monhegan, and says, oh, gives you the latest news in Boston. So there are a whole series of links via boats, via letters, via word of mouth, that enabled people to tap into this amazingly complex system of communication that the Europeans had and the Native Americans had. In lieu of a catch, they could have done that if they're going down to negotiate something, let's say in Boston in 1677, as I know happened, and later. You got a guy that's coming down as one of the Sagamores, a Penobscot Sagamore. He's going to Boston to negotiate with the governor at the time, and he brings along his retinue. They hang out in Boston. They're treated pretty well. They're put up. They get the latest news. Now you get a report of another Passamaquoddy's coming down to Boston with news of what's going on in Quebec. And so you see it on both sides of this equation. Native American communication and English. Somewhat different, but in other ways not that much different. Now, we touched on this very briefly. Wabanaki were trapping beaver well before the trade that blew up took off with the presence of the French and English in New England. But the difference is they were basically trapping them for what they needed. They were tasty, the tails in particular were tasty enough not only that Native Americans would roast them, but the French did the same. They actually found evidence up at Penagoet in the Penobscot River of remains of beaver skull and actually a bear skull. That was probably part of a repast that was prepared for a dignitary coming in there. So you have these carryovers not only in transportation, but foodways. European, English, Native American, etc. So now we have a commercial driver. You're not only getting beaver for food, for their pelts to keep you warm in the winter months, and your kids in the skins, moose skins, same thing. But now you have something that is the latest rage. Come on now. What are we doing here? The Beaver Felt Hat. Now, if you wanted to be in the know and you wanted to show everybody how deep your pockets were, this is what you'd be wearing. One of our historic interpreters has a great, and we use this image, hat that is imitated. It's a nice big top domed hat with this wide brim. And we're looking at one guy, a merchant, who's got the dough to purchase it. This one in particular was found in, I think, the harbor, probably mud flats, and they were able to basically conserve it intact. So that was all the rage by the late 1500s, carried on well into the 1600s. Throughout Europe, plays over into New England and beyond. So kind of a neat little. Now this is just sort of a give you a little sense. It wasn't what you would have seen in Pemaquid or the Damariscotta, etc. But you did have some trading canoes that Native Americans used and the French used more so in the interior of Canada by the late 1600s, where you're talking about a canoe that's a good 25, 30 feet long, and as you can see there, what you got about 8 paddlers. And then, of course, a Frenchman in the middle in all his finery out in the boonies. So this is another example of what has happened with the animal trapping pelt industry. It's become big-time money, and consequently it kind of gets things out of whack for a lot of the indigenous populations, because now they're over hunting because they need, this is another way to get trade goods, a new flintlock, a matchlock, et cetera, et cetera. So it throws things out of balance and it creates a problem, and to the point where by the 1660s there are a series of beaver wars that break out, and this is not only going on in parts of Maine, but it originates in Dutch country in New York and spills over into Maine and other parts of New England. And that devastates the Native Americans too, not only economically, but as far as demographics. So this gives you just sort of a general sense as to what you would have seen, let's say by, forget the 18th century, but a lot of these still would have existed in the early 17th and 18th century. Norridgewock right in here, which was a major Jesuit overseen village. Well, I shouldn't say overseen, but Father Rails was there, and actually where he had met his demise in 1724. But very important to the Wabanaki prior to his presence, even in the late 1600s, 1690s. Taconic, another important village on the Kennebec River. And here we are, not Fort Pemaquid, that would have been Fort William Henry at the time, and Fort Charles, its predecessor. Penagoet, the Acadian presence in the Penobscot River, et cetera, et cetera. So quite a few of villages, the Native American villages, that would have been interacting, but at the same time, both politically, economically, et cetera. And this also gives you a sense as to how far, in times of peace and war, they could have traveled via their canoes, or by this time now with the presence of the English and the French, they now can hop on a regular supply ship that is sailing, let's say, from, we get down to there, not quite, Boston, up to, let's say, southern Maine, Saco River, up to Pemaquid, up to the interior, on the Kennebec here, Kennebec over here, Penobscot here, to get back to your village, or to meet with other peers, Native American peers. And this, I've got a lot of insight into that, at least in the early 1700s, when I've been looking at John Giles, where you had regular vessels. It wasn't quite as pronounced in the, let's say in the 1680s and 90s, but it did occur where you could literally hop on to a ship that's coming out of Boston, or is heading back south from, let's say, Pemaquid or further up the coast, and as a diplomatic emissary, Native American, and go that way. Or you can cobble together routes through coasting vessels, part-time on foot, etc. So again, they have now a new means of transport along with their traditional tools that they had. With this new development of trade, you have regularization. And you now, as I alluded to before, beaver being the moneymaker and being sort of the standard applicable item that everything else was based on. So one beaver skin in season, when it's most valuable, you could get 20 skeins of thread. You can get needles. You can get russets or ruffles, which is Russells, which is a trade blanket. A sword blade, not because they're duelers, but because they oftentimes will use that sword blade to use as a cutting tool, not just as a weapon. Anyway, it gives you some idea, and even here, minks in season is equal to, in this case, I think we're looking at 8 minks. So clearly the beaver is the more valuable of the two. But they're all in play. Beaver, fox, bear, moose. But the big money makers and the most valuable, as I said earlier, are the beaver and moose skins. And Pemaquid is heavily involved in that. They're not trapping the animals, but they are coming to a guy like Thomas Gardner, who was based at Pemaquid from around 1660 to 1676. When the first attack occurs. And he's well respected and well known by both the Wabanaki and the French. Guess who shows up in 1672 at Pemaquid Harbor? Anchors in probably the outer harbor. Henri Brunet, a well-known French merchant who hangs out anywhere from almost the whole coast of Nova Scotia, lives in Boston periodically from 1672 to 1676. He sticks around 3 or 4 days. Gardner is on board his ship, talking turkey, having dinner, hanging out. 2 days later, Brunet goes to Monhegan and leaves, and I'm not quite, it sounds like Gardner, but I'm not sure, the minister a silver tobacco container and a Bible in English. So he knew his customers. So again, this all runs contrary to a lot of what people still, to a certain degree, now you guys look sophisticated, but anyway, just bring some new things out, to the world that was far more, as I always say, nuanced, many shades of gray when you're looking at the relationships. I'm not ever saying everything was hunky-dory, but there was a lot more interaction. A lot of it was practical. I don't like you, but you got something I want on both sides, Native American or European. And these are some local trade items that I found up at about a mile upriver from Pemaquid, a fortified trading, a hamlet that dates back to around 1630, around 1675. What we're looking at is let's back up here. A red clay smoking pipe, stem is missing. That was a common trade item with Native Americans. A brass jetton here that may date back to late 1500s, early 1600s. A cloth seal that typically was applied for a whole variety. Either it's identifying the merchant that owned that textile. Anyway, a trade good. You want some duffels or you want some broadcloth. That would have been attached to it for a whole host of different reasons. And then, interesting enough here, anybody recognize this guy? It's a mouth harp. It's just missing the twanger in the middle there. They still are made today. And then a variety of glass beads. All very popular items, something that would have appealed to either male or female as some ornamentation, whether it's on your beaded sheath for your knife, that as a male I would have been carrying around my neck, to fringe around my waist as a woman, or my sleeves. So again, items that are coming to Pemaquid by canoe and leaving by canoe and then working your way back, or through trade elsewhere in the Kennebec River, Cushnock, places like that. Now, things go south, in large part due to what's going on in southern New England. King Philip's War breaks out in 1675 in Rehoboth, basically sort of the southeastern Massachusetts, due to the usual stuff that I'm sure most of you people have heard. Loss of land, Native American, trade abuses, abuses as far as cattle, livestock, pigs rooting in cornfields, livestock. Your livestock are going through our traditional cornfields and not addressing. You just say, screw you, I'm not, it's tough luck, I can't control everything. And in time, you have issues up the coast of Maine because of fishermen, in part, who are a bit of a rough group. And so this stuff blows up. And Pemaquid was caught in the middle, despite the efforts of Thomas Gardner and his brother-in-law, John Earthy. Gardner negotiated with his brother-in-law a number of times between 1675 and 1676, actually to the point where he goes to Taconic. How does he get there? Canoe? Foot? Combination of both? Shallop up to Kennebec and beyond? So again, you're seeing that all we can do is speculate as far as that goes, but nonetheless, he's doing that. It doesn't work. And so the village, and the whole settlement is wiped out. It's burnt down. No deaths, as far as we know. But then there's a second, and this is devastating, as you can see here, all up and down the coast of Maine, essentially up into French Acadia. And so that's it for a fairly short period, about a year. Pemaquid is then resettled. But the point being that then there's a second raid in 1689 where it's much bloodier. What I'm getting at is now we're going to look briefly, and to wrap things up, as to the impact that conflict had on the Native Americans' standpoint when it came to transportation and other things. As I alluded to briefly, is that they now realize that one way of getting back at the English is to hit their fishing fleets. So they start attacking them, as I said earlier, up in Nova Scotia, Monhegan, and capture these vessels and sail them. 2 of them are dumped at Pemaquid, so that when they negotiate a year later in February of 1677, Pemaquid hasn't been resettled, but they're negotiating, meeting with Major Waldron, who's one of the penultimate scumbags as far as the English goes. Not a nice guy, but very powerful. They have the 2 fishing catches, Salem fishing catches, that are hanging out at Pemaquid. Why did they bring them there? Whole series of possibilities. It's a well-known location, but nonetheless, they're there and they negotiate back and forth, and eventually they get them back, the owners, the Salem-based owners. There are other cases where they overpower these fishing vessels and keep them. They attack them in canoes, and they're fairly heavily armed, and I'm sure the fishermen were armed somewhat, but not to the degree that Native Americans were, and a whole series of these attacks where they have captured upwards of about 24 of the fishing. And so it's a real problem. It's really hitting the fleet, and this continues in the 1680s and 90s. And we now have a change. With resettlement, 1677, we have the first formal fortification built at Pemaquid. And where do these folks, the soldiers, come from? And a number of the civilians come from? Not Boston, not Massachusetts. They do later on, but New York, Manhattan. And this is due to the Duke of York's grant initially given by James II to his brother in 1664 that encompasses basically land from Kennebec River all the way up to St. Croix. So this becomes a rationale later on for why New York jumped in the game. They beat Massachusetts to it, and so for the next, from 77 to 86, they own Pemaquid. So it has a New York flavor. But so ships now are coming not only from Boston, but from Manhattan, up and down, and that kind of stuff. But with a military garrison, I'm going to jump through this real quickly, of not only Fort Charles, when you have a community here, you have now, for the first time, a sloop that patrols the waters from the Kennebec River, one sloop, all up to St. Croix. Now this is a small boat, probably manned with, maybe a crew of about 10, and maybe 5 or 6, small bore cannon, and they're covering that much territory. Guess who won out? The 17th century smugglers, thinking 1930s, moonshiners. Maine was very popular because you have all these coastline convoluted peninsulas. You could hide your hooch in your boat and go up to Canada. So anyway, that was a very difficult enterprise to follow up on as far as the crew at Pemaquid, the garrison itself, to patrol a huge stretch of land in this little sloop. But where did I put my clipboard? I have to, if I can find it, get a little bit into what else, the role that ships played, at least from the English standpoint, in this time period, so warfare. Obviously, one thing that you're doing is you have to keep that garrison supplied. So you have a whole series of examples where this occurs. The most interesting one, and I'm not going to read through it in great detail, was an account that was written in the summer of 1677. And this runs for about 3 pages. And they're bringing up supplies, because at this point they're building Fort Charles out of Manhattan. They bring up through 3 sloops to bring all the supplies, timber, that kind of stuff. But they also are bringing an anchor of lime juice. Okay? 2 firkins of soap. Just make sure that they don't smell as bad as I do. 28 pounds of white soap. 2 sticks of wax. What's the wax for? Your letters. Okay? Your stamp, you melt it and seal that up. 2 pointers and 2 rings for compasses. So now you have instruments that are being used to basically lay out your footprint of your fortification. 1 heading knife, a hoe, a drawing knife. Or if you've been over to see our dwelling, we have a shave horse there and a draw knife where you can cut your wood. 7,000 large shingle nails. 200 single 10 nails, 10 penny nails, and on and on and on. So you have that going on, and this is a regular routine. They're coming initially out of Manhattan. Later on, they come out of, actually these supplies are coming out of Portsmouth and Boston, a deal that's worked out with merchants there. But ships are regularly coming up now that you have this garrison. So again, same thing. It's not only supplying your garrison, but it's providing a means for Jody here again, trying to keep track of her husband, who's now in Manhattan. Okay, or get some nice silk, French silk that's in Manhattan. Okay, John Cook in 1688. So we jumped a good almost 11 years. Sails up in His Majesty's sloop Mary. So this is now one of these regular vessels that is coming up on a prescribed, probably month or 2 month routine. And this is something that both the French and Native Americans are well aware of. The scheduling, and if they want to attack them, they just check the calendar and see when they might be coming up. So they're doing that. They're delivering new troops. A couple of guys have died at Fort Charles in the late 1680s. So it's practical means, correspondence, supplies, and in the 1680s and mid-1690s, you would have witnessed 2 major negotiations between the English, Massachusetts Bay, and Wabanaki. August 1677, you have upwards of, what was it, about 20 canoe loads of Wabanaki coming from the Penobscot region, past Pemaquid, further south in Maine, and setting up shop for a good 2 weeks to negotiate with the English over abuses from their standpoint. They want a prisoner exchange. They want to negotiate over abuses as far as their fishing grounds being abused or taken advantage of by the millers on these rivers where they have mills on, et cetera, et cetera. They are canoeing over. Some are probably being brought in by English vessels. So there's a whole series of references to, again, transport and this interplay between Native American and English. And the last example, and I'll leave it at that, as far as how this is playing out, are our two unfortunate garrison members at Fort William Henry, so the second of these three forts, that were out in a small birchen canoe. What they were doing in the outer harbor in February, March of 1695, I don't know, with weather like that. But nonetheless, it's only one example. And my guess is that there were far more, whether they owned it or this is one of their transports, because they had regular, in one case they had a gondola, which, anybody familiar with what a gondola looks like? It's basically a barge, glorified barge that has a lateen sail and a stump mast that you can drop down if you're passing over a bridge or whatever to get through. Shallow draft, they go almost anywhere, and they were using, in this case, to go up the Damariscotta River, up to the whaleback, they didn't call it whaleback then, to get oysters, to burn them, to make lime, to make this crappy mortar they made that caught up with them later on. But nonetheless, another example of transport. What are you using to get back and forth? Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So hopefully you folks tonight have gotten a little sense as to the role that these two different forms of transportation, Native American and English/European, played not only amongst the people that brought them over, but these other folks that they met through intentional choice and others not so intentional over basic about a 75-year period. It gets even more interesting because there's more documentation in the 1700s, first half of the 1700s. So anyway, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.